Judge mocks teenager in court, shocked to learn he's a genius attorney in disguise. The gavel slammed down, a sharp, metallic punctuation mark that echoed in the high-ceilinged courtroom. Judge Calvin Thompson, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with a world-weary cynicism, adjusted his glasses and surveyed the room with an air of profound boredom. The air smelled faintly of old paper and stale coffee, a familiar scent he'd grown to both despise and depend on. "Next case," he announced, his voice a dry rasp that carried more authority than warmth. "Let's try to keep this briefer than Tolstoy, shall we?" A nervous-looking woman, clutching a battered handbag, shuffled forward. She was accused of disorderly conduct, excessive noise during a late-night bingo game. Thompson barely let her stammer out a defense before he cut her off. "Madam, do you deny or confirm that you were shouting bingo at 3 a.m. with such fervor that you woke half the neighborhood?" The woman paled. "Well, Your Honor, I was just so excited." Thompson sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes. "Excitement is no excuse for disturbing the peace. 20 hours of community service, cleaning up the park. Next." He waved dismissively, already turning his attention to the next file. A young man with a skateboard tucked under his arm was brought before him, charged with trespassing. Thompson leaned back in his chair, studying the boy with open disdain. "Skateboarding on private property. A truly heinous crime. A menace to society you are." He paused, a flicker of something akin to amusement dancing in his eyes. $50 fine, and I want that skateboard impounded. Consider it a donation to the court." The boy's jaw dropped. But that's all the money I have." "Then perhaps you should have thought of that before choosing to engage in your extreme sport," Thompson retorted, his voice laced with sarcasm. He tapped the gavel impatiently. "Next." He dispensed justice like a harried clerk stamping documents, quickly, impersonally, and with minimal consideration. A parking violation, dismissed with a warning. A minor shoplifting charge, community service, and a lecture on the virtues of honest labor. A barking dog complaint, a stern warning to the owner, and a veiled threat of further action. Each case was a minor irritant, a fly buzzing around his head. He longed for something substantial, something intellectually stimulating. His family, particularly his brother the renowned surgeon, never failed to remind him of his potential. He'd had the grades for a top-tier law firm, maybe even a Supreme Court clerkship. Instead, he was stuck here, presiding over petty squabbles and mundane infractions. A lawyer, a young woman with fiery red hair and an even fiercer expression, approached the bench, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a continuance for my client, Mr. David Miller. He's unable to attend today's hearing due to..." Thompson cut her off mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing. "Continuance denied. I'm tired of these delaying tactics. Where is your client, Ms.?" He peered at her file. "O'Malley? He's indisposed, Your Honor. A family emergency." Thompson's lips curled into a thin smile. "Indisposed? How convenient. Is this family emergency a sudden attack of conscience, perhaps? Or maybe he simply realized the futility of fighting the inevitable?" He gestured to the bailiff. "Bring Mr. Miller in on a contempt charge. We'll see how indisposed he is then." The red-haired lawyer stood her ground, her eyes flashing with defiance. "But Your Honor, that's completely unwarranted. You have no grounds." "I have grounds," Thompson interrupted, his voice dangerously low. "I am the grounds. Now, are you going to comply, or do I add obstruction of justice to the list?" He slammed the gavel down again, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the suddenly silent courtroom. The power, raw and unchecked, vibrated in the air, a tangible thing. He knew he was pushing it, testing the boundaries. And a small, insidious part of him enjoyed the feeling. The street performer. A caterwauling harmonica, slightly off-key, sliced through the hum of the city. Buses rumbled, and the cadence of hurried footsteps provided a discordant backdrop as Ethan, perched precariously on an overturned crate, feigned indifference to the curious glances thrown his way. Clad in clothes that swam on his frame, his dark hair slicked down in a way he hoped suggested exertion. He was a caricature of teenage awkwardness. He butchered oats, peas, beans, and barley grow, each sour note deliberately prolonged. The location, just outside the courthouse, was no accident, prime visibility. What he craved was a specific kind of notice. It arrived sooner than anticipated. A gravelly voice shattered the musical assault. "All right, son, pack it up." Ethan staged a flinch of surprise, nearly fumbling the instrument. A police officer, broad-shouldered and unyielding, blocked his light, disturbing the peace. "You're with me." He managed a stammered protest. "But IW was." The sentence dissolved, his eyes wide with manufactured innocence. He allowed himself to be escorted away, the harmonica tumbling onto the concrete with a disheartening clang. Booking was a mere formality. Fingerprints smudged the pad, and a flashbulb illuminated a less-than-flattering mugshot destined for future regret. The desk sergeant offered a chorus of patronizing remarks, each one landing like a tiny, stinging pebble. Head bowed, the stammer a honed weapon, he spoke only when prodded. The performance was draining, each ounce of faux fear leaving a bitter taste. The courtroom was even more oppressive than imagined. Bleak fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, casting a sickly green hue across the anxious faces of the gathered defendants. Ethan, palms slick, shifted on the unforgiving wooden bench. A current of genuine apprehension tightened his chest. The charade was about to face its jury. When his alias, Elijah Thorne, echoed through the room, he nearly tripped in his haste to reach the stand. Judge Calvin Thompson, a man whose features seemed permanently sculpted by cynicism, barely gave him a second glance. "Thorne, Elijah?" The judge's voice was a monotone rasp. Ethan swallowed hard, throat suddenly dry. Why, yes, sir." He avoided the judge's gaze, fixating instead on the ornate carvings adorning the bench. Thompson emitted a sigh that conveyed volumes of wearied disapproval. "Disturbing the peace. Playing, what was that supposed to be?" Ethan shuffled, his oversized shoes scuffing against the worn floor. "H harmonica, sir. IW was trying to make a little money." Thompson's lips twisted into a disdainful smirk. "Well, you've earned yourself a court date. Do you understand the charges?" Ethan nodded, the movement sharp, almost convulsive. "Why, yes, sir." A trickle of sweat snaked down his temple. The spotlight felt like a physical brand, the judge's scrutiny a tangible weight. The moment of truth had arrived. Could his meticulously crafted persona withstand this level of inspection? He needed to maintain the facade, cling to the stammer, let the manufactured fear bloom. Just a little longer. Mockery in the court. "So, Mr. Thorne," Judge Thompson drawled, leaning back in his oversized leather chair, the springs groaning in protest. "Or should I say, Ethan? Quite the alias for someone accused of disrupting the peace, wouldn't you agree?" Ethan stood ramrod straight before the bench, the cheap suit he'd been forced to wear feeling like a shroud. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom seemed to amplify every imperfection, the fraying cuffs, the slightly too short sleeves. He swallowed, the dryness in his throat making it a rough, audible sound. "Your Honor, I was attempting to." Thompson cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand, the gold signet ring on his pinky finger catching the light. "Attempting what, Mr. Thorne? To audition for a role in a particularly inept street theater production? Perhaps you were practicing your endangered youth routine for a local drama club?" A ripple of muffled laughter spread through the courtroom. Ethan clenched his jaw. He'd anticipated skepticism, but this was blatant mockery. He'd spent weeks building a persona, enduring the grime and the condescension, all to get close to the network. Now, it was all unraveling in this sterile, brightly lit room. "I was observing," Ethan said, forcing the words past the lump in his throat. "Gathering information?" Thompson raised a skeptical eyebrow, his jowls shaking slightly. "Observing? Gathering information? Tell me, Mr. Thorne, does your information gathering typically involve shouting obscenities at vendors and attempting to incite a riot? Because that's what the arresting officer seems to recall." Ethan felt a flush creep up his neck. He'd been goaded, yes, pushed to the edge by a calculated series of provocations. But how could he explain the intricate game he was playing, the delicate balance he was trying to maintain, without revealing the true purpose of his assignment? There were extenuating circumstances, he stammered, knowing how weak it sounded. Thompson chuckled, a low, guttural sound that echoed in the otherwise silent courtroom. Extenuating circumstances? Is that what they're calling juvenile delinquency these days? Perhaps we should start handing out participation trophies instead of sentences. He turned to the stenographer, a bored-looking woman with tired eyes. Make a note, Ms. Peterson. Extenuating circumstances will now be the official legal term for acting like a hooligan. The laughter intensified, sharper this time, laced with open contempt. Ethan felt a burning shame, not for what he'd done, but for the way he was being portrayed, the way his efforts were being trivialized. Thompson leaned forward, his gaze hardening. Mr. Thorne, I've seen your type before. Thinks he's smarter than everyone else, thinks he can bend the rules to his will. Well, let me assure you, this court will not tolerate such arrogance. I intend to make an example of you, Mr. Thorne. A clear and unambiguous example. He picked up a gavel, the polished wood gleaming under the harsh lights. I find you guilty. Sentencing will be. He paused, savoring the moment. 3 months in juvenile detention. A voice of counsel. Judge Calvin Thompson adjusted his spectacles, the lenses catching the courtroom's harsh fluorescent light. He steepled his fingers, a gesture Ethan had come to recognize as a prelude to unpleasantness. Mr. Thorne, he began, the name dripping with disdain. The evidence presented has been illuminating. Your actions, while perhaps born of youthful naivete, constitute a clear violation of the law. You manipulated the system, wasted the court's time, and frankly insulted its intelligence. He paused, letting his words hang in the air like a stale odor. I had hoped, given your alleged academic prowess, you might have demonstrated some semblance of remorse. Instead, we've been treated to a series of increasingly absurd justifications. Ethan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The Ethan persona was fraying, the carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of Thompson's condescension. He tasted bile, a bitter residue of the charade he'd been forced to maintain. Therefore, Thompson continued, oblivious to the internal battle raging within the defendant, it is the judgment of this court that you serve. With the court's permission, Ethan interrupted, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sliced through the judge's pronouncements like a laser. Every head in the room snapped toward him. Even Thompson seemed momentarily startled, his mouth agape like a landed fish. Ethan didn't wait for an answer. He stood straighter, his shoulders squared, the nervous slouch that had defined his posture for months evaporating as if it had never existed. He pushed his glasses higher on his nose, not with the habitual, awkward gesture of Ethan, but with a decisive flick of his wrist. I would like to address the court as counsel. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation system. Thompson's face, already florid, deepened to a shade of crimson that threatened apoplexy. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery, a confused buzz that escalated in intensity. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keyboard, frozen in mid-stroke. Even the bailiff, a man who'd seen it all in his 30 years of service, looked genuinely bewildered. Thompson sputtered. Counsel? Mr. Thorne, you are the defendant. You are not an attorney. This is preposterous. Ethan met the judge's gaze, his eyes clear and steady, devoid of the anxious flicker that had characterized Ethan's every interaction. A ghost of a smile played on his lips. With all due respect, Your Honor, appearances can be deceiving. He paused, letting the implication sink in. And the truth, as you are about to discover, is often far more complex than it seems. The revelation. Silence! Judge Thompson's voice cracked like a poorly fired clay pot, the sound echoing off the high ceilings of the courtroom. He slammed his gavel with enough force to make the wood tremble. I will not tolerate any further outbursts. Mr. Davis, as I was saying, your blatant disregard for the law. He droned on, listing petty offenses, his face reddening with each accusation leveled at the hapless teenager standing before him. Ethan shifted in his seat, the cheap fabric of his thrift store suit chafing against his skin. The weight of the charade was becoming unbearable. He could feel the tension in the room, the suffocating despair emanating from young Davis and his distraught mother. Enough. Just as Judge Thompson was about to deliver the final, damning sentence, Ethan rose to his feet. The movement was slow, deliberate, a stark contrast to his usual clumsy demeanor. He cleared his throat, and the sound cut through the judge's tirade like a knife through butter. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice resonating with a newfound authority that nobody in the room had ever heard before. He straightened his shoulders, shedding the slouch that had defined his Ethan persona. "My name is Elijah Thorne, and I am a licensed attorney in the state of California." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Heads swiveled, eyes wide with disbelief. Murmurs erupted, a low hum of confusion and shock that threatened to drown out the judge's sputtering protests. Even Mrs. Davis, her face etched with worry moments before, looked up with a flicker of hope. Judge Thompson's face contorted in a mask of disbelief and mounting fury. "What is the meaning of this? You're that awkward boy who's been shadowing me for weeks. This is contempt of court. Bailiff, remove him." Ethan held up a hand, stopping the bailiff in his tracks. "I assure you, Your Honor, I would not interrupt these proceedings without just cause. I have been working undercover, investigating a pattern of judicial misconduct within this court. Specifically, the disproportionate and unduly harsh sentencing of minors from low-income backgrounds." He pulled a slim, leather-bound notebook from his inside pocket, its pages filled with meticulous notes. He opened the notebook, his gaze locking with Judge Thompson's. "I have documented several instances where your rulings appear to be influenced by personal bias rather than the merits of the case. And I have evidence to suggest a disturbing connection between these harsh sentences and the private juvenile detention center run by your brother-in-law." The color drained from Judge Thompson's face, leaving him ashen. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, for a lifeline. The air in the courtroom thickened, charged with anticipation. The murmurs grew louder, morphing into a cacophony of disbelief and growing excitement. Elijah Thorne had just dropped a bomb, and the fallout was about to begin. Evidence unveiled. "In light of the defendant's flippant disregard for the gravity of this court, I sentence him to..." Judge Thompson's voice boomed, the gavel hovering menacingly above its block. "Objection, Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice amplified by a newly installed microphone, cutting through the tense silence. A flicker of annoyance crossed Thompson's florid face. He detested interruptions, especially from this insolent youth. "Mr. Thorne, I warned you. One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt," Thompson snapped. Ethan ignored the threat. "I have evidence, Your Honor, that will prove your impartiality has been compromised." A ripple of murmurs went through the courtroom. Vivian Holloway, seated near the back, leaned forward, her eyes narrowed with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. Was this it? The moment of truth? Thompson scoffed. "Evidence? What nonsense! You're grasping at straws, boy. Bailiff, remove him!" Ethan stood his ground. "Before you do, Your Honor, I request the court to allow the presentation of audio and video recordings that directly implicate you in unethical and potentially illegal activities." He pressed a button on a small remote in his pocket. Suddenly, the courtroom's antiquated speakers crackled to life, filling the room with Thompson's unmistakable voice, slurred and laced with malice. "That meddling Inspector Davies thinks he can touch me? I'll bury him. And that little environmental group? Shut them down. We'll call it a zoning violation. Easy peasy." The recording ended abruptly. A collective gasp swept through the room. The jurors exchanged shocked glances. Thompson's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "That's doctored. Fabricated," he roared, pounding his gavel, but the sound was weak, drowned out by the rising tide of voices. Ethan pressed the remote again. A video flickered to life on a large screen that had materialized, seemingly from nowhere, behind the judge's bench. It showed Thompson accepting a large, unmarked envelope from a known associate of the very corporation he was ruling in favor of in the current case. The angle was clear, the faces undeniable. Vivian felt a surge of adrenaline. She'd suspected, she'd investigated, but she hadn't dared to hope for anything this concrete. Thompson's carefully constructed facade crumbled. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He fumbled for his water glass, his hand shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. "This is a conspiracy. A personal vendetta," he stammered, his voice losing its commanding tone. Ethan's demeanor had shifted. The awkward teenager was gone, replaced by a controlled, articulate lawyer. "These recordings are authenticated, Your Honor. They are time-stamped and cannot be easily manipulated. The evidence speaks for itself." The courtroom buzzed with a chaotic energy. Reporters scrambled to take notes. Spectators whispered in disbelief. Thompson, once the figure of absolute authority, now looked small and pathetic, trapped in the spotlight of his own corruption. The silence stretched, broken only by the frantic clicking of cameras. All eyes were on Judge Thompson, awaiting his next move. He knew, everyone knew, the game was up. Justice intervenes. Judge Thompson's face was a roadmap of fury, veins throbbing on his temples as he slammed his gavel with enough force to make the courtroom lights flicker. "Contempt! I find you in contempt, Mr. Thorne. 1 year! 1 year in county jail for this charade!" Before the bailiffs could react, a new voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the chaos. "That will not be necessary, Judge Thompson." All eyes turned to the back of the courtroom, where Judge Eleanor Reynolds stood, her face etched with a deep disappointment that seemed to age her 10 years. The air itself seemed to deflate as the weight of her presence settled over the room. She moved with a quiet dignity, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces, Ethan, pale but defiant, the weeping single mother, and finally, settling on Judge Thompson, whose bluster seemed to evaporate under her scrutiny. "Judge Thompson," she said, her voice firm but laced with sorrow, "I've reviewed the transcript of this hearing, and I have serious concerns about the conduct of these proceedings." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Effective immediately, you are suspended from your judicial duties pending a formal investigation by the Judicial Conduct Board." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Thompson sputtered, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "Eleanor, you can't." "I assure you, Calvin, I can, and I am." Judge Reynolds' voice brooked no argument. "The sheriff will escort you to your chambers. You are to gather your personal belongings, and then you will leave the courthouse." She gestured towards a pair of uniformed deputies standing at the ready. They moved forward, their expressions grim. As Judge Thompson, looking utterly defeated, was led away, Judge Reynolds addressed the courtroom, her voice ringing with authority. "This court is now in recess. Mrs. Davies," she said, singling out the woman who had been moments away from losing her children, "your case will be reassigned, and I assure you, it will be heard with fairness and impartiality." Vivian Holloway felt a surge of vindication. This was it. The crack in the dam. She hadn't anticipated such a dramatic intervention, but the opportunity was too good to miss. Already her mind was racing, formulating the headline. She grabbed her notepad, a familiar weapon in her hand. The story was far from over. As the courtroom emptied, Vivian approached Ethan, who was now surrounded by reporters, their microphones a thicket around him. He looked overwhelmed, the awkward Ethan persona struggling to reassert itself. She waited for a break in the throng, then stepped forward. "Mr. Thorne, if I could have a moment?" she asked, holding up her press credentials. "Vivian Holloway, with the Gazette. I'd like to get your perspective on what just happened." Ethan met her gaze, a flicker of something knowing in his eyes. "Ms. Holloway," he said, a ghost of a confident smile playing on his lips, "I think I have a story you'll want to hear." The press conference. The ballroom hummed, a low, anxious thrum under the weight of 100 reporters. Camera flashes pulsed like a nervous heartbeat. Elijah, standing behind the podium, adjusted the microphone, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the ill-fitting clothes Ethan usually wore. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the scent of lilies from the floral arrangements doing little to calm the knot in his stomach. "Good morning," he began, his voice amplified, resonant. "My name is Elijah Thorne. You may know me as Ethan Bellwether." A murmur rippled through the room, a wave of recognition washing over the expectant faces. He allowed the sound to subside before continuing. "For the past several months, I have been operating undercover in this city, investigating systemic corruption within the juvenile justice system." He laid out the facts, carefully, concisely. The skimming of funds, the biased rulings, the blatant disregard for due process. He spoke of the families he'd met, the lives irrevocably damaged, the futures stolen. He didn't sensationalize, he simply presented the truth, bolstered by meticulously documented evidence. "My motivation," he said, meeting the gaze of a reporter from the Sentinel, "is simple: justice. Every child deserves a fair chance. No one, especially not those entrusted with power, should be allowed to steal that chance." Across town, Judge Thompson watched the press conference on a small television screen in his chambers. His face, usually ruddy with good cheer, was now a sickly shade of gray. He clenched his jaw as Elijah spoke of biased rulings, a cold sweat prickling his skin. The phone rang, and he snatched it up. "Yes?" he barked. It was the mayor's office. The tone was terse, the message clear: damage control was paramount. Later that afternoon, Thompson emerged from the courthouse into a maelstrom. Reporters shoved microphones in his face, their questions a barrage of accusations. "Judge Thompson, how do you respond to the allegations of corruption? Did you knowingly deprive underprivileged children of their rights? Is it true you received kickbacks from the juvenile detention center?" He stammered, attempted to deny, to deflect, but the cameras were relentless, capturing every twitch, every stumble, every bead of sweat that trickled down his temple. He tried to regain control, to project the image of righteous indignation, but the practiced performance felt hollow, unconvincing. Back at the press conference, Vivian Holloway from the Gazette raised her hand. "Mr. Thorne, many are questioning your methods. Going undercover as a juvenile, some might consider that exploitative." Elijah met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "I understand those concerns. It was not a decision I took lightly. But I assure you, every action I took was guided by a commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The end, in this case, justifies the means. Sometimes, the only way to shine a light in the darkness is to become a part of it." Thompson held another press conference the following day. He announced an internal investigation, promising full cooperation. He even shed a few carefully placed tears, invoking the memory of his late wife and her unwavering dedication to children. The performance fell flat. The public, already swayed by Elijah's compelling presentation and the irrefutable evidence, wasn't buying it. The narrative had shifted. The hunter had become the hunted. The lilies in Elijah's press conference room suddenly seemed less fragrant, the weight on his shoulders heavier. The victory felt hollow. He knew the fight was far from over. A hero's return. The mahogany door of Thorne and Associates swung inward, revealing Elijah bathed in the warm glow of the reception area. Gone were the ill-fitting suits and nervous stammer of Ethan. This was Elijah Thorne, the man whose name adorned the building, his tailored gray suit impeccable, his gaze sharp and self-assured. A spontaneous round of applause erupted from the gathered staff. He offered a wry smile, a hint of the discomfort Ethan would have worn, but quickly composed himself. "Thank you," he said, his voice resonant and clear, a stark contrast to the hesitant tones they'd grown accustomed to. "It's good to be back." His office, untouched, was a testament to the faith they'd placed in his return. He ran a hand over the smooth surface of his desk, the familiar scent of leather and old books filling his senses. A single photograph sat in the center, his parents smiling, their eyes filled with pride. He picked it up, a flicker of sadness crossing his features, a reminder of the legacy he carried. He had work to do. Meanwhile, in a far less opulent courtroom, Judge Calvin Thompson stood before Judge Eleanor Reynolds. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation and a palpable sense of justice about to be served. Thompson's face was a mask of barely controlled fury. His hands, usually so steady when wielding the gavel, trembled slightly as Judge Reynolds delivered her verdict. "Judge Thompson," she began, her voice unwavering, "the evidence presented before this disciplinary committee is irrefutable. You have abused your power, displayed blatant prejudice, and undermined the very principles of justice you swore to uphold." Thompson's jaw tightened, the color draining from his face. "Therefore," Judge Reynolds continued, "this court finds you guilty of judicial misconduct. Your license to practice law is hereby revoked, and you are permanently removed from the bench." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Thompson sputtered, attempting to interrupt, but Judge Reynolds silenced him with a single, steely glance. "Furthermore," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "the transcripts and evidence will be forwarded to the district attorney's office for consideration of criminal charges." The fight seemed to drain out of Thompson then, leaving him a defeated, crumpled figure. As bailiffs led him away, a hush fell over the room, broken only by the soft sobs of his wife in the gallery. Back at Thorne and Associates, Elijah was already at work, poring over case files. He paused, listening to the muffled sounds of celebration from the outer office. He knew the victory wasn't just his. It was a victory for the legal system, a small crack in the wall of corruption and prejudice. Later that evening, as twilight painted the city skyline in hues of orange and purple, Elijah sat alone in his office, a single lamp illuminating his face. He picked up a pen, a new case file opened before him. It was time to build on the momentum, to ensure that what had happened to Maya didn't happen again. He began to write, the scratching of the pen a quiet promise in the still night. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt a glimmer of hope. The system wasn't perfect, but maybe, just maybe, it was starting to listen.